Now that your husband is gone, you should start packing. This house isn't yours anymore, my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm, almost polite, as if she were reminding me to take out the trash and not erasing 38 years of my life in a single sentence. And what hurt more than her words was the quiet agreement sitting beside her, my son Daniel, staring down at his plate as if the mashed potatoes held more meaning than the woman who had raised him. And for a moment I thought I had misheard her, that grief had distorted the room, because it had only been 7 days since we buried my husband, 7 days since I stood beside a polished oak casket and said goodbye to the man who built this home with me board by board, paycheck by paycheck, year after year. And yet here I was, sitting at the same dining table we bought together in 1989, being told I no longer belonged under the roof I had helped pay for, helped design, helped turn into a place people once called warm. And I remember the way the overhead light flickered slightly, the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the faint smell of roasted chicken still lingering in the air, all the ordinary details that suddenly felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life unravel instead of my own. And I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I needed to understand how we had arrived at this moment without me noticing, how the little boy who used to run into my arms after school had become a man who couldn't even meet my eyes while his wife told me to leave. And Jessica, she always had that tone, sweet on the surface but sharp underneath, the kind of voice that made everything sound reasonable even when it wasn't, the kind that could turn cruelty into something that felt almost justified if you didn't look too closely. And she leaned back in her chair slightly, crossing her legs, waiting for me to react, as if this were just another conversation about groceries or schedules, not a declaration that I had somehow lost my place in my own home. And Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, hesitant, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Mom, it's a lot for you to manage now. And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because of how carefully he avoided the truth. Because managing the house had never been the problem. I had managed it through layoffs, through raising him, through my husband's long hours, and later through his illness. I had managed it through everything life had thrown at us, and yet now suddenly I was too old, too incapable, too unnecessary. And I realized then that this conversation hadn't started tonight. It had been building quietly, in small decisions I hadn't questioned, in conversations I hadn't been included in the way Jessica had started organizing things without asking me, the way Daniel had stopped calling as often, the way my opinions had slowly become optional, then irrelevant, and finally inconvenient. And I looked around the dining room, at the walls we painted ourselves one summer, at the framed photos of birthdays and holidays, at the small scratch near the baseboard from when Daniel crashed his toy truck into it at age 6, and I felt something shift inside me, not break, not shatter, but settle into something colder, something clearer. And I stood up slowly, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor, the same floor my husband had insisted on installing himself to save money, and I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, my hand steady despite the storm building beneath the surface. And for the first time that evening I looked directly at my son, really looked at him, searching for the boy I once knew, but all I saw was a stranger wearing his face. And that was the moment I understood that this wasn't just about the house, it was about something much deeper. Something they had already decided long before this dinner, something that didn't include me. And I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, as if I were accepting the rules of a game I hadn't realized I was playing. And without raising my voice, without letting them see the weight of what they had just done, I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the sound of their silence, because if they thought I would fight them in that moment, if they thought I would plead or argue or remind them of everything I had given, they didn't understand me at all. And as I walked up the stairs to the bedroom that still smelled faintly of my husband's cologne, I already knew something they didn't, something that would change everything. Because the next morning, I wasn't going to beg them to let me stay, I was going to the bank. I did not sleep that night, not in the way people imagine sleep, not the kind that brings rest or comfort, but in short, shallow moments where my eyes closed out of exhaustion and then opened again to the same quiet ceiling, the same empty space beside me where my husband used to lie. And every time I reached out without thinking, my hand found nothing but cold sheets, and each time that happened it felt like losing him all over again, only this time it was layered with something else. Something sharper, something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with betrayal. And I lay there listening to the house, to the subtle sounds I had known for decades, the pipes settling, the faint ticking of the hallway clock, the wind brushing against the windows, and I realized that even those familiar sounds felt different now, as if the house itself had shifted its loyalty, as if it no longer recognized me as the woman who had once filled it with life, and some time before. Dawn, I sat up slowly, carefully, the way I had learned to move during my husband's illness so I would not wake him, a habit that no longer had a purpose but still lived in my body, and I looked around the room at the dresser we bought together, at the photograph of us taken 20 years ago at the lake, both of us smiling into the sun, unaware of how quickly time would pass, and I let myself sit in that memory for just a moment before I stood up and walked to the closet, not to pack, not yet, but to remind myself of something important, something I had almost forgotten in the shock of the night before. And that was, this house was not just a place, it was a record of every decision we had made, every sacrifice, every promise, and I had been there for all of it, not as a guest, not as someone who was simply allowed to stay, but as an equal, as a partner, as someone whose name might not have been spoken in that conversation at dinner but whose presence was built into every wall. And that thought stayed with me as I went downstairs, the early morning light just beginning to filter through the kitchen windows, casting long soft shadows across the floor. And for a moment everything looked the way it always had. The coffee maker on the counter, the small crack in the tile near the sink, the chair my husband used to sit in while reading the newspaper. And I moved through the space quietly, making a cup of coffee the same way I had for years, measuring the grounds, filling the water, waiting for that familiar sound. And when I finally sat down at the kitchen table, I noticed something that should not have mattered but did. My place setting was gone. The small placemat I used every morning had been moved, replaced by nothing, as if someone had already begun to erase me in small, careful ways, and I did not react, not outwardly. I simply set my cup down on the bare wood and took a sip, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, grounding me in the present, reminding me that this was real, that what had happened the night before was not a misunderstanding, not a moment of grief spoken too harshly, but a decision, a deliberate, quiet decision that had been made without me. And I thought about Daniel, about the way he had looked down at his plate, about the way he had avoided my eyes, and I tried to find some explanation that would make it easier to understand, some version of him that would make his silence less painful. But the truth was simpler and heavier than anything I could invent. He had chosen, and he had not chosen me, and that realization did not bring tears, it brought clarity, a kind of stillness that settled deep inside me, replacing the confusion, replacing the instinct to question myself. And as I sat there finishing my coffee, I made a decision that felt both small and enormous at the same time. I was not going to argue with them, I was not going to defend my place in a home that I had helped build, because doing that would mean accepting their version of reality, a version where I needed permission to belong, and I did not, I never had, and instead I stood up, rinsed my cup, placed it carefully in the sink and walked toward the front door, pausing only briefly as I reached for my coat, the one my husband had given me 5 winters ago, the fabric still soft, still familiar, and as I slipped it on, I caught my reflection in the small mirror by the door, an older woman, yes, with silver hair and lines that told the story of a long life, but also someone who had endured more than this, someone who had navigated loss, change, and uncertainty before, and I held that gaze for a second longer than usual, not searching for reassurance, but acknowledging what I already knew, that I was not as powerless as they believed, and then I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, closing the door gently behind me, not slamming it, not making a scene, because there was no need for that, not yet, and as I walked down the driveway, past the garden we had planted together, past the mailbox with our family name still printed neatly on the side, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, the kind that comes when a path becomes clear, even if it is not the path you expected, and I got into my car, started the engine and drove away from the house without looking back, not because I did not care, but because I already knew exactly where I was going, and more importantly, I knew exactly why. I had not driven to that part of town in years, not since my husband handled most of our financial matters himself, always saying he would take care of everything so I would never have to worry, and at the time I believed him in the simple, trusting way that comes from decades of shared life, never imagining that one day I would be sitting alone behind the wheel, gripping it just a little tighter than usual as I pulled into the parking lot of the bank, the same bank we had used for over 30 years, the same place where we opened our first joint account when Daniel was still in elementary school, when money was tight and every dollar had a purpose, and as I turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that this step mattered, that whatever I was about to learn inside those glass doors might confirm something I was only beginning to understand, and I stepped out of the car, smoothing my coat instinctively, the morning air still cool against my face as I walked toward the entrance, noticing how ordinary everything looked, people coming and going, a man talking on his phone, a young woman adjusting her bag on her shoulder, life moving forward in that steady, indifferent way it always does, and I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the soft chime announcing my presence, the familiar scent of polished floors and paper and quiet efficiency surrounding me, and for a brief second I felt like I had stepped back into a version of my life that still made sense, where things were structured, predictable, where records existed and truth could be found in numbers and signatures, and I approached the front desk, offering a polite smile to the teller, who returned it without hesitation, asking how she could help me, and I gave my name, Margaret Whitmore, the name I had used in this building for decades, the name that had always been associated with joint decisions, shared accounts, mutual trust, and she nodded, typing it into her system before asking me to wait just a moment, and as I stood there, I became aware of how quiet my mind felt, not empty but focused, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away, leaving only what mattered, and after a short pause, another woman approached me, older than the teller, with a calm, professional demeanor that immediately reminded me of someone who had seen many situations unfold, some expected, some not, and she introduced herself as Linda, a senior account manager, asking if I would like to speak in her office, and I agreed, following her down a short hallway lined with framed certificates and photographs of community events, small reminders that this place had history, just like my home did, just like my life did, and we sat across from each other at a modest desk, and she folded her hands gently, giving me her full attention, and I explained carefully that my husband had passed away a week ago, that I was beginning to organize things, to understand what needed to be handled, and she nodded with quiet sympathy, offering her condolences without making it feel like a formality, and then she asked for some identifying information, which I provided without hesitation, and she began to pull up our records, her eyes scanning the screen, her expression neutral at first, then shifting ever so slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice, and I have learned over the years that it is often the smallest changes in expression that reveal the most, and I waited, not interrupting, not rushing her, because I understood that whatever she was seeing needed to be processed correctly, and after a moment she looked back at me, her tone still professional but now carrying a note of careful consideration, and she asked if anyone else had been involved in managing the accounts recently, if there had been any changes, any updates, and I shook my head slowly, explaining that my husband had handled most of it, that I trusted him to do so, that we had always operated that way, and she nodded again, but this time there was something else in her gaze, something that suggested this was not going to be as straightforward as I had hoped, and she turned the monitor slightly toward me, pointing to a section of the account history, and I leaned forward just enough to see rows of transactions, transfers, adjustments, all laid out in precise detail, and at first it looked like what I expected: routine payments, utilities, insurance, the normal flow of a household, but then I noticed something that did not fit, a series of transfers that I did not recognize. Amounts that were not small but not large enough to immediately raise alarm if you were not paying attention, consistent, deliberate, spaced out over time, and I felt a quiet shift inside me as I followed the pattern with my eyes, as I realized that these were not random, not accidental, and Linda spoke carefully, explaining that over the past year there had been several changes to the account structure, that additional access had been granted, that certain permissions had been modified, and as she said those words, I did not feel shock in the way I might have expected. I felt confirmation, as if something I had sensed without fully understanding was now being placed clearly in front of me, and I asked her calmly who had been given access, and she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering, and when she said Daniel's name, followed by Jessica's, I closed my eyes briefly, not in denial but in acknowledgement, because this was the missing piece, the part of the story that had been unfolding quietly while I was focused on taking care of my husband, on being present in the only way I knew how. And I opened my eyes again, meeting her gaze, and I asked her to show me everything, not just the recent changes but all of it, every document, every authorization, every signature, because I needed to see the full picture, not to react emotionally, but to understand exactly what had been done. And as she began to gather the records, printing out statements, organizing the information in front of me, I realized that the conversation at the dinner table had not been the beginning. It had been the final step in something that had already been set in motion long before my husband passed away, long before I had any reason to question the people I trusted most, and as I sat there in that quiet office, surrounded by papers that told a story I had not been allowed to hear until now. I felt that same calm settle over me again, stronger this time, more defined, because now I knew that what they had taken was not just a house, not just a place to live, but something built on trust, and trust, once broken, does not return. It transforms into something else, something sharper, something that does not forget. The papers were spread out neatly in front of me, each page aligned with a precision that felt almost deliberate, as if order itself could soften what they revealed, and I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, not touching anything yet, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that once I started reading, there would be no returning to the version of my life that existed before this moment. And Linda remained quietly across from me, giving me space, allowing the silence to settle in a way that felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. And I picked up the first document slowly, my eyes moving across the lines of printed text, legal language that was both familiar and distant at the same time, and I recognized my husband's name immediately, his signature appearing exactly as I had seen it thousands of times before, steady, deliberate, unmistakable, and for a brief second I felt a flicker of reassurance, a reminder that he had always been careful, always thoughtful, always someone who planned ahead, and that thought carried me into the next page and the next until I reached the sections that had been added more recently, the ones that carried different dates, different contexts, and as I read, the pieces began to fall into place, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet, methodical clarity that left no room for denial, because the permissions that had been granted, the changes that had been made, they had not been forced, they had not been taken without authorization, they had been given, signed, approved, and that realization might have broken me if I had allowed myself to see it as betrayal from him. But I did not, because I knew him too well. I knew the way he thought, the way he trusted, the way he believed that family would always act in good faith. And I could see now how easily that trust could have been guided, redirected, shaped by someone who understood exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. And I placed the document down carefully, my fingers lingering for just a moment on the edge of the paper, and I moved to the next set, the transaction history, the numbers laid out in clean columns, each entry a quiet record of something that had already happened, something that could not be undone. And I traced the pattern again, more slowly this time, following the dates, the amounts, the destinations, and I noticed how consistent it was, how intentional, not large enough to raise immediate concern, not small enough to be insignificant, just enough to shift the balance over time, just enough to create a new reality without drawing attention to it. And I thought about the past year, about the long afternoons I spent sitting beside my husband, holding his hand while he slept, about the evenings when I was too tired to think about anything beyond the next day. And I understood how it had happened, not as a single act but as a series of small, calculated steps taken while my attention was elsewhere, while my priorities were exactly where they should have been, on the person I loved, on the life we had built together. And that understanding did not bring anger, not yet. It brought something quieter, something more controlled, a recognition that what I was looking at was not chaos, it was a plan, and plans, no matter how carefully constructed, always leave traces, always reveal the intentions behind them if you know where to look. And I turned to Linda, my voice steady, asking her to explain the timeline, to walk me through when these permissions were granted, how they were documented, who was present, and she did so with a professionalism that did not attempt to soften the facts, explaining that the additional access had been established several months ago, that it had been formalized through proper channels, that everything appeared legitimate on the surface, and that phrase stayed with me, legitimate on the surface, because it suggested something deeper, something that went beyond what could be seen in signatures and forms. And I nodded slowly, absorbing each detail, not interrupting, not questioning her process, because I knew she was showing me exactly what existed within the system, and it was up to me to understand what existed beyond it. And as she finished, I gathered the papers into a single stack, aligning them carefully, mirroring the order in which they had been presented to me, and I felt that same calm settle into place again, stronger now, anchored by knowledge rather than uncertainty. And I realized that the conversation at the dinner table, the quiet dismissal, the suggestion that I no longer belonged, it had not been based on assumption or impulse, it had been supported by these documents, by these changes, by a version of reality that had been constructed piece by piece until it could be presented as fact. And that was the true weight of what I was holding, not just evidence of financial decisions, but proof of intention, proof that I had been gradually moved from the center of my own life to the edge of it without being told, without being asked. And I stood up slowly, not because the conversation was over, but because I had seen enough for now, enough to understand the shape of what had been done. And I thanked Linda for her time, for her clarity, for her willingness to show me everything without hesitation, and she nodded, offering to assist further if needed, but I could tell she understood that what came next was not something she could guide, and I walked out of the office with the copies in my hand, the weight of the paper surprisingly solid, a physical reminder that this was not just a feeling, not just a suspicion, but something real, something documented. And as I stepped back into the main area of the bank, the same quiet rhythm of daily life continuing around me, I felt a shift that was no longer subtle, no longer forming but complete, because now I knew that what had been taken from me was not done in a moment of grief, not spoken in haste, it had been prepared, organized, and executed with patience, and that meant something very important, something that settled into my mind with absolute clarity. If they had taken the time to plan this, then I would take the time to respond. I drove back slowly, not because of traffic, not because I was unsure of the road, but because I needed the time to let everything settle into place, to let the facts I had just seen stop being abstract and start becoming something I could use. And the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had, the same trimmed lawns, the same mailboxes lined up in quiet order, the same sidewalks where I used to walk with my husband in the evenings when the air cooled down after long summer days. And it struck me how unchanged everything appeared on the surface, how nothing in the world around me reflected what had shifted so completely beneath it. And when I turned into the driveway, I noticed the car was already there, Daniel's car, parked slightly off-center the way he always did when he was in a hurry, and I sat in my own car for a moment, the engine still running, watching the house, the windows reflecting the late morning light, giving nothing away, and I thought about walking in, about confronting them with what I knew, about placing the papers on the table and asking for an explanation, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before. Confrontation would not give me truth, it would only give them time to adjust their story, to soften their actions, to make what had been deliberate seem like misunderstanding, and I turned off the engine, stepped out, and walked toward the door with the same steady pace I had used for years, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving forward. And when I opened the door, the house greeted me with that familiar quiet, but there was something else layered into it now, something subtle but undeniable, a sense that the space had been rearranged in ways that did not include me, and I closed the door behind me gently, setting my keys down in their usual place, noting that even that small habit felt like an act of quiet defiance, and as I moved further inside, I could hear voices from the living room, low, controlled, and I paused just long enough to recognize them, Daniel and Jessica, speaking in that careful tone people use when they think they are being discreet, and I did not make my presence known immediately, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to listen, to understand what they said when they believed I was not part of the conversation. And Jessica's voice came first, measured, confident. "We need to finalize everything before the end of the month. The sooner it is done, the cleaner it will be." And Daniel responded with a hesitation I recognized, the same hesitation from the night before. "She is still here, Jess, we cannot just..." And she cut him off gently but firmly. "She will not have a choice once the paperwork is complete. It is already in motion, you saw that yourself." And I stood there, just out of sight, feeling that same clarity sharpen, because this was not speculation, this was confirmation. Their plan was not only real, it was active, progressing, and I stepped forward then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm presence that made them both turn at the same time, their expressions shifting in an instant, surprise first, then something else, something guarded, and I offered a small, polite nod as if I had just entered any ordinary room on any ordinary day. And Jessica recovered quickly, her smile returning in that practiced way. "Oh, you are back already," she said, as if my absence had been expected, as if my return required acknowledgement, and I nodded, removing my coat slowly, placing it over the back of a chair, my movements deliberate, controlled, giving myself time, giving them time to settle into whatever version of the moment they wanted to present. And Daniel looked at me then, really looked, his eyes searching for something, perhaps a reaction, perhaps a sign that I had heard more than I should have. But I gave him nothing beyond a calm, steady gaze, and I walked past them into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, the simple act grounding me, allowing the silence behind me to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. And then I turned back toward them, leaning lightly against the counter, and I spoke in the same even tone I had used for years when discussing practical matters. "I will need a little time to organize my things." And Jessica nodded immediately, too quickly, as if she had been waiting for those words. "Of course, we can give you 2 weeks, that should be more than enough." And I held her gaze for a moment, just long enough for the meaning to settle. 2 weeks, not a suggestion, not a conversation, a timeline, and I inclined my head slightly, accepting it without argument, without resistance, because arguing now would serve no purpose. And Daniel shifted beside her, a flicker of something crossing his face, but he said nothing, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. And I turned away again, moving toward the hallway, toward the staircase, each step measured, each movement part of a decision that had already been made, not here, not in this room, but earlier in that office with those papers in front of me. And as I reached the first step, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the railing my husband had installed himself, the wood worn smooth from years of use, and I allowed myself one final thought before continuing, not of loss, not of what had been taken, but of what remained, because what they believed they had secured, what they believed they controlled, was only part of the story, and the rest of it, the part they had not considered, the part they had not planned for, was already in motion. And I continued up the stairs without another word, leaving them behind in a silence that no longer belonged to me. I closed the bedroom door behind me with a quiet click, not to shut them out, but to create a space where I could think without interruption. And for a moment I stood there, looking at the room that had once been ours, the bed still neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway as they had been that morning, the faint scent of my husband's cologne lingering in the air as if time had paused just long enough for me to catch up. And I walked to the dresser, opening the top drawer slowly, not because I needed anything from it, but because the motion itself steadied me, the familiarity of it reminding me that not everything had been taken, not everything had changed. And I sat down at the edge of the bed, placing my hands flat against the quilt, feeling the texture beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something real, something tangible, because everything else now felt like a carefully constructed illusion that I had finally seen through. And I let my mind move back, not to dwell in the past, but to examine it, to look at the moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, the conversations that had felt ordinary, the small decisions that had not raised concern, and one by one they began to align in a way they never had before. Jessica offering to help with paperwork when my husband's health began to decline, Daniel suggesting it would be easier if certain accounts were managed online, the quiet shift in tone when I asked questions, the gentle reassurances that everything was being handled, that I did not need to worry. And I realized now that I had not been excluded all at once, I had been eased out, gradually, carefully, in a way that made each step seem reasonable until the distance became too great to bridge without effort. And I stood up again, moving to the closet, opening it fully this time, looking at the rows of clothing, the suits my husband had worn, the dresses I had saved for special occasions, and I reached for one of his jackets, running my hand along the sleeve, remembering the way he used to straighten it before leaving the house, the small habits that defined a life shared over decades, and I allowed myself a single, quiet breath before placing it back exactly where it belonged, because I understood something clearly now. This was not just about loss, it was about ownership, about who had the right to decide what remained and what was taken. And I was not ready to surrender that, not without understanding every piece of what had been done. And I walked to the desk in the corner of the room, the one my husband had used for years, the surface still holding a few scattered items, a pen, a notepad, a small stack of envelopes, and I opened the top drawer, not expecting anything in particular, but as I did, I noticed a folder tucked neatly beneath a set of older documents, something I had not seen before, or perhaps something I had not paid attention to, and I pulled it out. Slowly, the weight of it heavier than the thin paper suggested, and I sat down again, placing it on the desk, opening it with a steady hand, and inside were documents that looked different from the ones I had seen at the bank, older, more formal, the kind of paperwork that was prepared with intention, with foresight. And as I read the first page, I felt that same clarity sharpen into something more defined, because this was not part of the recent changes. This was something my husband had arranged earlier, something separate from the accounts, something that spoke to a different kind of preparation. And I leaned closer, reading each line carefully, absorbing the language, the conditions, the signatures, and I saw my name there, clearly stated, not as a secondary party, not as someone with limited access, but as the primary beneficiary of the home, with specific clauses attached, clauses that outlined what would happen under certain circumstances. And I felt a shift, not emotional, not reactive, but strategic, because this document did not erase what had been done, but it changed the outcome. It introduced a factor they had not accounted for, something that existed outside the changes they had made, something that could not be altered without my knowledge. And I read further, my focus narrowing, my thoughts aligning with each sentence. until I reached the section that made everything unmistakably clear, a condition tied directly to residency, to the right to remain in the home, a condition that could not be overridden by any transfer of funds or access to accounts, and I sat back slightly, the weight of that understanding settling into place, because this was not just protection, it was foresight. My husband had anticipated something, perhaps not the exact situation, but the possibility that circumstances could shift, that trust could be misplaced, and he had acted accordingly, and I closed the folder carefully, placing my hand on top of it for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of acknowledgement, because this was the piece they did not know about, the part of the story that had not been included in their plan. And I stood up, carrying the folder with me, moving back toward the bed, placing it inside the drawer of the nightstand, out of sight but not out of reach, and I looked around the room once more, not with the same sense of uncertainty I had felt the night before, but with a new perspective, one that recognized both what had been lost and what remained, and as I turned toward the door, I understood that the next steps would require patience, not confrontation, not immediate action but careful timing, because they believed the outcome was already decided. They believed I would follow the path they had set. And for now I would let them believe that, because sometimes the most effective response is not to oppose directly but to allow others to move forward with confidence until the moment arrives when that confidence is no longer supported by reality. And I opened the door, stepping back into the hallway with the same calm I had carried since the morning, knowing that everything from this point on would unfold exactly as it needed to. The next 2 days passed in a quiet rhythm that would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. And that was exactly the point. I woke up at the same time, moved through the same rooms, followed the same routines I had carried for years, making coffee in the morning, folding laundry in the afternoon, preparing simple meals in the evening, and I spoke when spoken to, answered questions with calm, measured responses, never raising my voice, never challenging anything directly, and I could feel them watching me, not constantly, not obviously, but in those small, subtle ways people do when they are trying to understand whether their plan is working, whether the outcome they expect is unfolding as intended. And I gave them what they needed to see, a woman who had accepted her situation, a woman who was preparing to leave, a woman who would not resist, and it did not take long for the shift to happen. Jessica became more relaxed, her movements less guarded, her tone lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. And Daniel, he still avoided my eyes, but there was less tension in the way he moved through the house, as if my silence had given him permission to believe that everything was settling into place. And I watched them both carefully, not with suspicion anymore, but with clarity, observing how quickly people adjust when they believe they are no longer being questioned. And on the third morning, I began to pack, not in a rush, not dramatically, but with deliberate care, selecting items from the closet, folding them neatly into boxes, choosing what would go and what would remain. And I left certain things untouched, the larger pieces, the items that define the space, because I understood their expectations. They believed I would remove myself completely, that I would strip the room of my presence, leaving it ready for whatever they had planned next, and instead I packed just enough to make the process believable, just enough to create the appearance of compliance. And as I moved through the room, I kept the folder close, hidden where it could not be found, reviewing its contents in quiet moments, committing every detail to memory, every clause, every condition, until I no longer needed to read it to understand its power. And later that afternoon, Jessica approached me in the hallway, her expression carefully composed. "Let us know if you need help with anything," she said, her tone carrying a hint of politeness that had not been there before, and I met her gaze, offering a small appreciative nod. "I will manage," I replied, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to satisfy her, because it confirmed what she wanted to believe, that I was handling things on my own, that I was not going to complicate the situation. And that evening, Daniel lingered in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, watching as I folded another stack of clothes, his presence hesitant, uncertain, and I did not look up immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for him to feel it before I finally spoke. "Is there something you need?" And he shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to make sure you are okay," he said, the words sounding rehearsed, disconnected from the weight they were meant to carry. And I paused, placing the folded shirt into the box before turning to face him, studying his expression, searching for something familiar, something that might still connect him to the boy I had raised. But all I saw was distance, and I nodded once. "I am fine," I said, my voice even, and he seemed relieved by that answer, as if it absolved him of something he did not want to confront. and he left without saying anything more, and I returned to the task at hand, continuing the process with the same steady pace, because every action now had a purpose. Every moment was part of a larger sequence that needed to unfold without disruption. And by the end of the week, the room looked different, not empty but reduced, the boxes stacked neatly near the door, the surfaces cleared just enough to suggest departure, and Jessica began making small comments about timing, about arrangements, about how things would be easier once everything was finalized, and I listened without reacting, without correcting her assumptions, because her confidence was essential. It needed to remain intact until the exact moment it no longer served her. And on the 8th day, she mentioned that a meeting had been scheduled, a formal step. She called it something that would wrap things up cleanly. And I acknowledged it with a simple nod, asking for the time and location, committing it to memory without hesitation, because I understood now that this was the point they had been working toward. The moment where everything would be confirmed, where their version of events would be solidified into something official. And I moved through the next few days with the same quiet consistency, preparing, observing, allowing them to move forward without interference. And on the morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully, not formally, not dramatically, but with intention, choosing something simple, composed, something that reflected exactly what I wanted them to see. And as I stood by the front door, ready to leave, I took one final look at the space around me, not with nostalgia, not with regret, but with understanding, because this house had always been more than just walls and furniture. It had been a place shaped by decisions, by trust, by shared effort. And now it was about to reveal something else entirely, and I picked up my coat, my keys, and the folder I had kept hidden, and I stepped outside without a word, knowing that what came next would not be decided by emotion, but by truth. The building was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty, but controlled, as if every sound had been measured and approved before being allowed to exist. And I stepped inside with the same steady pace I had carried for days, my shoes making a soft, even rhythm against the polished floor. Jessica walking slightly ahead of me, her posture confident, her movements precise, while Daniel stayed just behind her, close enough to follow, far enough to avoid being seen as leading, and we were guided into a conference room where a man in a dark suit stood up to greet us, his expression professional, neutral, the kind of face that had seen many families sit in those same chairs under different circumstances, and I took my seat without hesitation, placing my bag carefully on the table, my hands resting lightly on either side of it, and the man introduced himself, explaining the purpose of the meeting in clear, structured language, outlining the documents that would be reviewed, the agreements that would be confirmed, and Jessica nodded along with each point, her confidence growing with every sentence, as if each word spoken was another step toward the outcome she had already decided was hers, and Daniel remained quiet, his gaze shifting between the table and the papers in front of him, avoiding mine entirely, and I listened without interruption, allowing the process to unfold exactly as they expected, because there is a certain power in letting others believe they are in control, in allowing them to reach the moment where they feel secure enough to stop questioning the ground beneath them. And when the documents were finally placed in front of us, neatly arranged, ready for signatures, I noticed the details immediately, the structure, the language, the way the ownership was being defined, transferred, solidified, and I picked up the top page, reading it slowly, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted them to see that I was taking it seriously, that I was following their process, that I was participating in the outcome they had planned. And Jessica leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but edged with anticipation. "It is straightforward," she said. "Just a formality at this point." And I nodded once, turning the page with deliberate care, and I could feel the moment approaching, not rushing, not sudden but inevitable, like something that had been building quietly for weeks finally reaching the surface. And when I reached the final section, the part that required my signature, I set the pen down instead of picking it up, a small movement almost unnoticeable. But it shifted the room in a way that could not be ignored, and the man across from us paused, his eyes moving from the document to me, waiting, and Jessica's expression tightened just slightly, the first crack in her composure, and I looked up, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since we had entered the room, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something steadier, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood, and I reached into my bag, pulling out the folder I had kept hidden, placing it on the table between us with a quiet, controlled motion, and for a second no one spoke, the presence of it enough to interrupt the flow they had carefully constructed, and I opened it, sliding a single document forward, turning it so it faced the man in the suit, Not Jessica, not Daniel, but the one person in the room whose role required him to recognize what it meant, and he leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses, his expression shifting from neutral to focused as he read, and I remained still, my hands resting calmly on the table, allowing the silence to stretch, allowing the weight of that document to settle without explanation, because explanation was not necessary, not anymore, and after a moment, he looked up, his gaze moving from me to Jessica, then to Daniel, and there was a change in the room that could not be undone, a shift in balance that did not need to be announced, because it was already understood, and Jessica's voice came next, no longer as steady as before. "What is that?" she asked, the question simple, but the tension behind it unmistakable, and I turned my head slightly toward her, my expression unchanged. "Something you overlooked?" I said, my tone even, and the man cleared his throat quietly, placing the document flat on the table, his voice measured as he began to speak, explaining the clause, the condition that had been set long before any of the recent changes had been made, outlining how it affected the ownership, the residency, the authority to make decisions regarding the house, and I watched as the understanding reached them, not all at once but in stages, Jessica's confidence faltering as the details became clear, Daniel's silence deepening into something heavier, something closer to realization, and I did not interrupt, did not add to the explanation, because everything that needed to be said was already written there, already signed, already in effect, and when the man finished, the room remained quiet, the kind of silence that follows a truth no one expected to hear, and I closed the folder slowly, placing it back into my bag, my movements as controlled as they had been from the beginning, and I looked at the documents they had prepared, still sitting untouched, in front of me, and then back at them, my gaze steady, not asking for acknowledgement, not seeking validation, simply recognizing the moment for what it was, the point where assumption ends and reality begins, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, the decision already made, the outcome already clear, because what they had built on quiet manipulation had just been met with something far stronger, something they had never considered, and there was nothing left for me to prove. No one spoke immediately after the explanation ended, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that could be said had already been rendered irrelevant by what now existed in writing, and I watched the way Jessica's posture changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the subtle tightening of her shoulders, the slight shift in her gaze as she looked back at the document as if reading it again might produce a different outcome, and Daniel remained still, his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the edge of the paper, as if he were trying to locate a version of events that no longer existed, and I did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence because it was not mine to resolve, it belonged to them now, and the man across from us cleared his throat again, his tone steady as he clarified the implications, explaining that the clause ensured my right to remain in the home without condition, that no transfer of funds, no adjustment of access, no agreement presented today could override what had already been established, and that any attempt to proceed without acknowledging this would be legally invalid, and I saw the words settle into them, not as something they could argue against, but as something they could not change, and Jessica finally spoke, her voice lower than before, less certain. "There must be something we can do," she said, not asking a question but searching for a possibility, and the answer came without hesitation. "Not under these conditions," the man replied, and I did not look at her when she turned toward me, did not engage with the expectation in her expression, because this was not a negotiation, not a conversation. That required my participation beyond what had already been done, and I reached for my bag, closing it calmly, the sound of the clasp soft but final, and I stood up, not abruptly, not with any display of triumph, but with the same composed movement I had carried from the beginning, and for a moment Daniel looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and there was something there I had not seen before, not confusion, not even regret, but recognition, the quiet understanding that the path he had chosen had led him here, and I held that gaze for a second longer than necessary, not to challenge him, not to forgive him, but simply to acknowledge that this moment existed between us, and then I turned toward the door, leaving the documents they had prepared untouched on the table, because they no longer held any meaning, and as I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if something that had been unresolved had finally reached its conclusion, and I walked through the building without looking back, the same measured pace, the same steady rhythm, until I reached the outside, the sunlight falling across the pavement in a way that felt almost unchanged, as if the world had continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to what had just taken place inside. And I paused for a moment beside my car, not out of uncertainty but out of habit, allowing myself a brief stillness before moving forward. And I thought about the house, about the rooms that still held the imprint of a life built over decades, about the garden, the kitchen, the small details that had once defined my place in that space. And I understood now that what I had defended was not just a physical structure, but the truth of my presence within it, the recognition that I had never been temporary, never been optional. And as I opened the car door, I heard footsteps behind me, quick, uneven, and I turned slightly to see Daniel approaching, his expression strained, his movements uncertain, and he stopped a few feet away, as if unsure how close he was allowed to come. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the distance between us filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had been assumed. And finally he found his voice. "Mom," he said, the word carrying a weight it had not held in days, and I looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that no longer needed to prove anything. And he continued, "I did not know it would." He stopped, the sentence unfinished, because there was no version of it that could change what had already happened, and I let the silence follow his words, not stepping in to complete them, not offering him a way out, because some realizations have to stand on their own. And after a moment I nodded once, a small deliberate gesture that acknowledged what he had said without accepting it as explanation, and I opened the car door, pausing just long enough to speak, my voice steady, my tone unchanged. "You did not lose the house," I said, meeting his eyes for the last time. "You lost something else." And I let the words settle without elaboration, without emphasis, because their meaning did not require it. And I got into the car, closing the door gently behind me, and as I drove away, I did not look back at the building, at Daniel, or at anything that remained behind me, because what had been decided today did not belong to the past, it belonged to everything that would come next. And I understood that the house would still be there, the walls unchanged, the rooms waiting, but the meaning of it all had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And that was something no document, no plan, no quiet manipulation could ever reclaim.